Hello and welcome to this In Focus special on CNBC Africa. My name is Zinati Guma. Now, on the sidelines of the 2021 Forbes Women Africa Leading Women Summit presented by Mastercard, Mastercard actually released the South African results of the latest Mastercard Index of Women Entrepreneurs Index. Now, this annual report sheds insights into the enablers and constraints of women's progress as business owners across 58 countries, or world economies rather, while the report highlights that women entrepreneurs are making strides to overcome some of the gender-related biases and advance their businesses in South Africa, they still face several structural and social obstacles, many of which have been exacerbated, of course, by the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, today we have Suzanne Morel, the country manager at Mastercard South Africa, to tell us more about this report. Now, Suzanne, what's interesting for me is that we've seen many reports amid COVID-19 as we face, a deepening unemployment crisis. We've seen many reports focusing on the employees and unemployment instead of actually focusing on entrepreneurs, the people that provide employment. And I mean, it has been said that business owners and SMMEs will be what actually, gets the economy out of the doldrums that it is in. And I just want to know from you, tell us more about this index, this Mastercard index for women entrepreneurs, and why it matters.
Sure, no, I'd be happy to. I mean, this is the fourth year that Mastercard is doing this index. And as you referenced, we look at 58 countries, which really it captures 80% of the female labor force. And the idea is to really take a global, compendium of all of this data, looking at things like the World Bank, the UN, the World Labor Organization, only to name a few, and to say, how can you create an index that's really going to be able to give us the insights that we need, really speaking to what is in fact driving women entrepreneurs as well as what's inhibiting them. So it looks at factors, I think recognizing the importance of things like government framework and legislation, talking about economic development and performance, things like education, also things like, social dynamics. I mean, what is the ultimate, cultural receptivity when it comes to women entrepreneurship? So, the reason it matters is because, one, you want to be able to understand what is in fact fueling women entrepreneurship as well as what's holding them back. I think with the idea not only of being able to provide an index for the sake of providing a number, but it's those insights that are underneath to use those to then in fact be able to guide, right, and affect change.
And of course, we want to know, what is in it for, South African entrepreneurs, women entrepreneurs. There are many different parts to this index, and I just want to know, what are some of the highlights that have stood out for you?
Absolutely. I think there are a few really interesting insights. I mean, when it comes to South Africa, South Africa moved up the list. So going back to, it's a total of 58 countries, moved up to 23 over the course of the last year. And that was largely fueled by underlying support for SMEs, as well as an uptick when it comes to that receptivity that I was mentioning to women entrepreneurship. But that said, you have a counterpoint. So despite that kind of healthy score, we also look from a benchmark perspective at what's happening around business, the percentage of business that are in fact owned by women. And looking at that, we noticed that it's only a 0.2% increase in South Africa, taking up to 19.4%. So despite a score where it's moving up, you're not in fact seeing the number of women increasing in terms of owning their businesses. Yet we look at the top of the list with regards to business ownership, and it's three other African countries that sit in the first, second, and third spot, starting with Uganda, Botswana, and then Ghana. Uganda has 39.6% women owning the businesses. So I think it's one of those insights that then you can look at and say, well, what in fact is there that we need to better understand? I always think that while we're talking about women entrepreneurship, ultimately we're really talking about women's economic empowerment. And when it comes to economic empowerment, it's not a zero-sum game. GDP growth is GDP growth, and any opportunity to be contributing to GDP should be seriously considered, regardless of gender.
And I mean, the index also provides analysis into some of the challenges that women entrepreneurs have been presented with the onset of COVID-19. And I just want to know, just walk us through some of the stats on how women have been affected by COVID-19, looking at women entrepreneurs.
Absolutely. No, I think looking globally, I mean, 87% of women entrepreneurs said that they were adversely affected by the pandemic. And there are a few underlying factors that really contributed to this. I think the first is that there's an overrepresentation of women in the sectors that were the most impacted. So looking at things like restaurants and food and retail. And if you look in the case of South Africa, 59% of women business owners are in fact operating in those sectors. I think the second is around childcare, and with childcare still predominantly falling, the responsibility still falling to women. And the third is looking, when you look at something like the pronounced digital gender gap. So when you think about it, a time when we've seen a real acceleration of all things digital, you can appreciate that if there's already a gap, that's even more pronounced in the time of the pandemic. I mean, I think it's interesting that McKinsey pre-pandemic was talking about 142 years before women would reach gender equality. And the UN recently added an extra 25 years. So it gives you an idea of how women have been impacted over this period of time.
And I mean, it's quite interesting that, in a time where women had already had challenges in terms of progression. COVID-19 exacerbated that. But on the flip side, there were opportunities, as you said, in terms of showing up for leadership, in terms of, for example, politically, some of the countries that have responded better to COVID-19 have been led by women. But I just, talking about opportunities, I mean, what are some of the opportunities that you are seeing for women entrepreneurs post-COVID-19?
I think where there is opportunity is, I would look at sort of what can we do in this new normal? And I think we have to agree, I think first and foremost, to kind of two principles, which is ultimately that we have that once in a lifetime opportunity. I think we can put women at the center. We can, and I think where they long belonged. I think the second part of it is to say, well, there's real economic merit, right, in recognizing the contribution of women, and that there is this untapped potential that sits there. I mean, the World Bank estimates that global economies are missing out on $172 trillion because over the lifetime of a woman and a man, that wage differential. So I think if we agree on those principles, then you can start to say, well, what are the opportunities and what are the things that we can be doing? I mean, going back to the index, looking at the countries that fared really well, I think just to use one as an example is Israel. I mean, they were number one on the list. I think while agreeing to the principles that I just referenced, they decided to make a very deliberate decision, which is how would they in fact move the needle? And in their case, it was that they would double the number of women entrepreneurs in the course of 2 years. And they had very strong institutional backing to do it. So I think what it allows is to say, if we believe that, then we can sort of at a very large scale, in fact, affect change. I think when it comes to the women entrepreneurs themselves, I think it's appreciating that we are moving into this digital space. So how, in fact, can you meet that, recognizing that we've accelerated all things digital in the course of the pandemic? So how can you show up in that space? And I think going back to the example of something like, Candy Smith, I think very quickly recognized that what she knew as her day-to-day was no longer going to be there. And if even it comes back in some capacity, she's going to have a consumer that is ultimately looking to meet that to some extent in an online environment. So I think making sure that you can participate in that digital space is incredibly important.
And I mean, Suzanne, you've mentioned that there are plenty of opportunities for women entrepreneurs out there, mid and post COVID-19. And I just, obviously we're not there yet. As much as there is progress being made, we're not there yet. There are still barriers. And, how can we, what are some of the workable solutions that we can use to remove some of these barriers to this progress?
I think it's to my point earlier, I think it's to make a very strong commitment. I think it's to recognize that we in fact have an opportunity like no other. And if we can agree that we want women to be at the center of this, that there is that untapped potential, that we want to address this gender divide once and for all, it's first and foremost making that commitment. Then I think it's very quickly translating that into action. So if I use, the example of what we do, Mastercard as a company, I think it's a recognition that we want to be front and center when it comes to really living that change. So not just agree to it in principle, but in fact to make it very real in terms of action. And so, some of the changes that you can bring forward to kind of overcome those barriers. I mean, in our case, it's how do we make sure that people are going to be included in a digital economy? And so we've made a commitment that by 2025, we'll bring in 1 billion people into the digital economy, 50 million micro and small businesses, but of that, 25 million women entrepreneurs. And that, I mean, you can translate into real actions around how do you fund them? How do you mentor them? How do you create digital products that actually meet their needs? I think in the case of South Africa, we've translated that in a very real way with something like Junior Achievement, where we said, we wanted to make sure that we're actually mentoring these women who are between the ages of 18 and 35, either own businesses or want to start businesses, to make sure that in fact they're successful.
I mean, we do know that Mastercard is an advocate for gender equality. Just even mentioning the 2021 Forbes Women Africa Leading Women Summit that was presented by Mastercard. And I just want you to walk me through, some of the things that you are doing as Mastercard to support this progression in, equality, and also just some of the partnerships that you have forged in order to move forward with that gender agenda.
Yeah, and we just talked about Junior Achievement. We've mentioned Forbes, and you're quite right. I mean, we're a company that do, we have a powerful brand name. We do sponsorships, but in the case of Forbes, what I love about it is it's really about how we're going to create an opportunity for women to connect, to share ideas, insights, to really affect some form of change, to talk about what it is that we want to see happen, but to bring in a real cross-section of women. So it's not just about women that sit in a business community, but how do you bring in academics? How do you bring in students? How do we bring in entrepreneurs? I mean, we've made a very deliberate commitment to making sure that we create something that's quite inclusive so that people get the opportunity and the benefit of this, because I do think it's incredibly uplifting. Another area where we make a commitment is around girls. So, we have a global program called Girls for Tech. It looks at girls between the ages of 8 and 12. And it's all about science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, and making sure that they're exposed and they consider studying in those areas. I mean, the reason that we do it is because we know over the course of the next 10 years, 80% of jobs are going to require some of those skills. And going back to, a business owner, I don't know a business now that isn't either straight in technology or is ultimately fueled by technology. So, you want to be able to plant the seed with these young girls and the idea of all that they can be.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your insights. That was Suzanne Morel, the country manager at Mastercard South Africa. Indeed, incredible work that they are doing to push the gender agenda forward. That's it from me, Zinati Guma. It's goodbye for now.